Welcome to session 2 of Christianity Explained. In this session, we're going to talk about what happened on the cross. It's really interesting. The cross has become the symbol of Christianity. If you look at most churches, you will find a cross somewhere, and many Christians will wear a cross around their neck. And it's really an interesting thing because the cross was in fact a symbol of torture and of humiliating death. So why is the cross so significant? We're going to unpack that in this session. But first, we're just going to do a quick recap of session 1, where Jesus came with the full authority of God as the Son of God. So last session, we covered that he had authority as a teacher. He had authority over evil spirits, over sickness. He had authority over nature, over life and death. And really importantly, he has authority to forgive sins. And finally, we talked about Jesus' authority over people, over you and I. But we have free will. We actually get to choose whether to follow Jesus or to not follow Jesus. And this week, we're going to look at Jesus and his death on the cross and why that's so significant. In session 2, we're going to talk about Jesus' death on the cross. But in session 1, we introduced Jesus as the Son of God very early in his ministry. And now we're talking about Jesus at the end of his ministry, some 3 years later. So what's happened between then and now is that Jesus has done amazing things. Some of those we covered in session 1. He's had lots and lots of followers, but he's also created enemies who don't want him around. People were flocking to Jesus and not flocking to the leaders, if you like, the leaders of religious law. So after a range of circumstances, Jesus is captured, betrayed. We talk a bit about that in a little while. And he's sent to the Romans and ultimately killed. And we're going to pick up that story now with what happens on the cross and why that is so important and so significant for us today. We'll start today's session by reading about the facts of the cross in Mark chapter 15, verses 33 to 39.
At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Then, at 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Some of the bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. One of them ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, holding it up to him on a reed stick so he could drink. "Wait," he said, "let's see whether Elijah comes to take him down." Then Jesus uttered another loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the Roman officer who stood facing him saw how he died, he exclaimed, "This man truly was the Son of God."
So we've just read the story of what happened on the cross. Now we're just going to unpack that and understand and talk through the meaning of the cross, why that is so significant for us today, why Christians hold dearly onto the cross. There's a number of things going on here. And in the first part, it talks about a darkness fell across the whole land for 3 hours. Jesus, was in fact on the cross for only 6 hours. Often people on a cross who were crucified lasted 4 days, but Jesus was actually flogged. He was beaten severely before he went onto the cross. So he was only on there for 6 hours, but for 3 hours, in the middle of the day, it became dark. Some people think that was an eclipse of the sun, but we know that can't be the case. And the reason for that is that Jesus was crucified at the time of the feast of the Passover. It's a Jewish religious festival which is held even today. And it's there to commemorate and to celebrate the Jews being freed out of Egypt. So if you go to the Old Testament, maybe you know the story, where the Jews were in Egypt. They were held as slaves for many years. And God sent Moses to free the slaves. And he went to Pharaoh and said, God has said, set my people free. And Pharaoh refused. So what God did is he brought upon the Egyptian people a range of plagues. One of the plagues was that all the water turned to blood. Another one was an infestation of locusts. Another one was an infestation of frogs. Another one was people came out in all sorts of boils, and so on, until the very last time, Pharaoh kept refusing to let the people go. The very last time, God went to him and said, Moses went to him and said, God has said, unless you let my people go, the firstborn, man and animal, across the whole land will die. And Pharaoh refused. But Moses said to the Israelites, to the Jewish people, if you paint your doorframe with the blood of a lamb, the angel of death will pass over and you'll be safe. So that's what happened on that night. The angel of death came through the land and the firstborn, man and animal, all died, except for the Jewish people who had painted their doorframe with the blood of a lamb. And God said to the people, I want you at this time every year to have a festival, to have a celebration, recognizing and remembering how I set you free. And it's called the Feast of the Passover. Now, the Feast of the Passover is always held at the time of a full moon. That's why you will find Feast of the Passover, that Easter is always March or April. I always used to think, why can't they just pick a date? But it's because it's always at the time of a full moon. And what you'll see is that it can't be an eclipse of the sun, this darkness, because an eclipse of the sun is simply the moon passing between the earth and the sun, creating a shadow. Many of us have actually seen eclipses, and they don't last very long, and you can actually see the shadow moving. So this lasted for 3 hours. And we also know that at the time of a full moon, the moon is in a very different position to an eclipse. So we know something supernatural is going on here at the time that Jesus is crucified. In verses 34 to 37, it talks about Jesus calling out, my God, why have you abandoned me? And it seems like, to some, perhaps that Jesus has lost his faith. But what's actually happened here is that really, in some respects, God has abandoned Jesus. In some translations, the word used is forsaken. That may be more helpful in the sense that forsaken means literally to turn your face from, to shun. So what's actually happening here on the cross? Why would that happen? Why would Jesus call this out? Well, let me explain it by way of an illustration which may prove helpful for you. I want you to imagine that this book here is the book of my life. And on this very first page is the day that I was born. And on this last page here is the day that I die. And everything in this book is about my life. Everything I've ever done or said or thought. Everything I should have done but didn't do. And of course, I don't know how far along I am in my book, but obviously I'm getting closer to the end than the beginning. And I have to be honest, there'll be many parts of my book I'd be embarrassed and ashamed for you to see, let alone a holy God. Now, I want you to imagine that my palm here is me and the ceiling is God. In some respects, what the Bible talks about is that between me and God is a barrier. It's the book of my life. It's the way that I have lived. And what will happen is that when I die, when I stand before God, he will open my book, and the first time he comes to a sin, he will need to reject me. A sin is simply when you live your life or when you do something that isn't the way that God would want you to. Now, I want you to imagine this hand here is Jesus and the ceiling is God. Between Jesus and God, there was no barrier. There was no impediment because Jesus always did the will of his Father. He was sinless. What's happened on that cross is that when he calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is he's taken my book and your book, the book of everyone who's ever lived or who will ever live, upon himself, with all the sin in the world upon himself. And God at that moment can't look at his son. He has to reject him. Now, what does that mean for us? What is now between me and God? There is no barrier. There is no sin, because Jesus has taken that upon himself. But it is a gift. It's a free gift. It's something that Jesus has done for all of us who will accept him, who will put our faith in him. If we don't put our faith in him, what we are saying is that when I die, I want to be judged by me. And of course, the moment that God opens our book and finds a sin, then he'll need to reject us. See, God is a holy and a just God. He's a loving God, but he's holy and just. He cannot bear to look at sin. At that moment when Jesus called out, in many respects, you could say that he's the most sinful man who's ever lived, because he's got all of our sin upon him. But God is holy and just. He needs to punish sin. And at that moment, Jesus took our punishment upon himself. So that is why he called out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Let's look at the next part of the passage and see something else that's very significant, which is easy to gloss over. It's in verse 38. Verse 38 says, and the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So what's that about? A curtain in a temple being torn. What we're talking about here is something that at the time would have been shocking and highly significant, and is significant for us today. In the temple was the centre of the Jewish religion. The temple was divided into a number of sections. So one section on the outside is where the people would come, and that's where they would buy or bring their sacrifices to God. So they'd buy or bring a pigeon or a dove or a lamb or some wheat, whatever it was that they were giving as a sacrifice, in partial payment, if you like, of their sins. The next part is where the chief priests and the priests would congregate. That's where they would do their ceremonies and so on. The next part is something called the Holy of Holies. And that is where God's Spirit would sometimes come. And between the Holy of Holies and the other sections is this curtain. Now, we're not talking about just a flimsy little piece of cloth here. We're talking about something very significant. It was approximately 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, and about 3.5 inches thick. It took 300 priests to lift it. Now, no one could go into the Holy of Holies where God's Spirit was, with the exception of the high priest. He could do that only on certain times, normally once a year. And he went in there, if you like, with God's Spirit to petition for forgiveness on behalf of the nation for the nation's sins. He would go in there after performing certain ceremonies, and he would have to wear a certain garb that had little bells all over it, and he had a rope tied around his ankle, because anyone who went in there dropped dead. And sometimes the chief priest would drop dead if God was displeased with him or with the nation. And of course they knew he was alive if the bells kept ringing. If everything was quiet, they needed to be able to drag him out by the rope on his ankle. So this is the situation. The moment that Jesus dies and calls out, my God, why have you abandoned me? That curtain is torn in two from top to bottom. In my early days as a Christian, when I first read that, I thought that was God showing his anger. But that's not it at all. It's something far more important than that. What it is it's demonstrating that no longer is there a barrier between us and God. No longer do we need priests to pray on our behalf. We can do that ourselves. We have a mediator in Jesus, and we can go directly to God. That's why often Christians pray in the name of Jesus. So you can imagine the shock when the Jews came and the Holy of Holies, the thing that they couldn't even think about, let alone observe, is suddenly open. So no longer is this barrier between man and God. And interestingly, it was torn in two from top to bottom, God reaching out to us, God making that way for us. Now we're going to go to Mark chapter 10, verse 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many. First of all, Jesus often referred to himself as the Son of Man, and that's part of a prophecy in the Old Testament where the Messiah was called the Son of Man. He often identified himself that way. But the bit that we just want to cover here is this whole idea of ransom. So normally ransom is associated where someone is held captive or kidnapped and cannot free themselves, needs someone to pay a price to buy them back. And that's the context here, that Jesus, as the Son of God, left heaven to pay a price for us, to free us, that we could not pay ourselves. So that's the whole ransom. So here in that passage, in the story today about Jesus on the cross, what we've covered is the darkness, indicating that something really supernatural was occurring when Jesus was on the cross. Secondly, the cry. If you remember the book illustration, and Jesus calling out, my God, why have you abandoned, or why have you forsaken me? And that separation between God and Jesus for the first time in all eternity, because he took upon himself our sins. Now remember, what then is the barrier between us and God if we accept what Jesus has done? No barrier. We talked about the curtain in the temple being torn in two from top to bottom, symbolising and showing there's no longer a barrier, a separation between us and God. No longer do we need priests to pray on our behalf, that we have direct communication with the Creator, with the God, the living God. And of course the ransom, the notion that Jesus paid a price that we ourselves could not pay. So in conclusion, Jesus' death on the cross is sufficient to pay the price for the sins of anyone. But God's forgiveness is not automatic. Forgiveness is there as a free gift, but you must accept and believe it as a Christian. So far, we have covered two of the basic concepts of Christianity. In session 1, we covered Jesus, the Son of God. Today's session, we've covered Jesus' death on the cross, the second leg of that stool. And next session, we talk about the resurrection of Jesus. So if you could, before the next session, if you could read the next 5 chapters of Mark, chapters 6 to 10, and we're really looking forward to seeing you for the next session, Jesus and his resurrection.